All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started this evening. Looks like we only have a few folks, so not a problem, but want to thank you all for joining me this evening. It is our final virtual rules seminar for the season. So if this is your first one or you've been to all five, just want to thank you for the support and thank you for being a member of the MSGA. My name's Elisa Hermes. I am our Director of Rules and Competitions here at the Maryland State Golf Association, and we are going to run through rules 10 and 11 today. So they do have a lot of information, especially rule 10. So we're going to try to get through everything. We may go a smidge over the hour, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to throw it into the chat, and I will do my best to answer as we go through. So our goals tonight are to find out what a stroke is and how you can prepare to make one. We're going to learn what types of advice you can and cannot receive and from whom you can receive it. We're going to learn what can a caddy really do, what happens when my ball accidentally hits something, and what happens if something deliberately is done or deliberate is done to my golf ball. As a reminder, as we go through the presentation, words in italics are definitions and they are the building blocks of the rules. So if you have a question about a particular rule or something within that rule, take a look at that and then go back to the back of the book or go into your app and look through the definition, and it should help provide just a little more clarity. And the general penalty when we see that statement is 2 strokes in stroke play or loss of hole in match play. So rule 10, making a stroke, we're going to see the definition of stroke. We'll find out about the purpose statement, and then we will learn about fairly striking the ball, anchoring the club, making a stroke while standing across or on the line of play, and playing a moving ball. So what is a stroke? A stroke is the forward movement of the ball made to strike the ball. Seems pretty common sense there, right? But a stroke has not been made if the player decides during the downswing not to strike the ball and avoids doing so by deliberately stopping the club head before it reaches the ball. So we're going to need to check off 2 different boxes: that the player decides not to strike the ball during the downswing, and the player also avoids striking the ball. So maybe if you can't check your swing in time, but you're deciding I don't want to hit this, and you like kind of swing up over it, that's going to not be a stroke. So when the rules refer to playing a ball, it means the same as making a stroke. So when you see that throughout the rules, we're going to kind of interchange those different terms. The player's score for a hole or a round is described as number of strokes or strokes taken, which means both all the strokes made and any penalty strokes. And then if we are playing maybe a net round or what have you, we're going to look at Rule 3.1C again, the rules directing us into different areas, so we're not retyping all of these rules that we've seen previously. So in making a stroke, the player must fairly strike at the ball with any part of the head of the club such that there is only momentary contact between the club and the ball. This means the player cannot push, scrape, or scoop the ball. So if you're, going to tap in your putt, you're not going to push that ball, or same with if you're in the middle of the fairway, you're not going to want to push the club or push the ball with the club. Additionally, if you hit the ball more than once and there's only been 1 stroke, there's no penalty taken. There's no penalty stroke. This is a change that was made a few years ago. So I know previously there had been that penalty, but now if you're just making 1 consistent stroke at the ball, you accidentally double hit it, that's okay. There's not going to be a penalty there. Anchoring the club. I know this can be a hot topic within the rules, but in making a stroke, the player must not anchor the club either directly or indirectly. So we're going to see 2 different examples here, one directly and one indirectly. So directly by holding the club against any part of the body. So here we see the end of the club directly against the player's body. This is not going to be allowed. They are anchoring. Or directly by holding a gripping hand against any part of the body. So here we can see this player is using their gripped hand and it's held against their body. So these are two cases that would violate the rule, but in the next slide, we are going to see an exception to this rule. So the player may hold the grip or the club or a gripping hand against a hand or forearm. So here we can see the difference between, there's no anchor point here. They're just holding it against their forearm. Indirectly, so again, we saw directly, here's indirectly. The player must not anchor the club through use of an anchor point by holding a forearm against any part of the body. So here we see this indirect anchor point, and the player's forearm is being held. And while the club is not directly anchored, there is still going to be that one anchor point. Or to use a gripping hand as a stable point around which the other hand may swing the club. So here it's kind of like a pendulum, you could think of it. So here the rest of the club is that pendulum. This is the anchor point where his hand is. We're not going to be allowed to do that within this rule. But if the player's club, gripping hand, or forearm just touches their body or clothing during the stroke, there's no breach of this rule. So that's totally fine. It's okay. That does happen from time to time. We are going to see this internal definition of forearms. You're like, Elise, I'm not really sure exactly what you mean by forearm. In this rule, forearm just means the part of the arm below the elbow joint and includes the wrist. So it's basically from the elbow down, including the wrist. That's going to be our forearm. So we do have in rules 25.3b and 25.4h, there are some modifications of this rule. So if you'd like to know more about this, if a player maybe is an amputee and they cannot hold the club or swing a majority of their clubs without anchoring, that's going to be okay. There's not going to be a penalty. Same if they're unable to hold the club and swing a majority of their clubs without anchoring because of use of an assistive mobility device, and they make their stroke while anchoring the club, that's okay. In rule 25, we're going to see, no penalty under this rule for anchoring. So the player must not make a stroke from a stance with a foot deliberately placed on each side of the line of play or an extension of that line behind the ball. So we're not really doing this croquet stance or, standing on either side like we see this player doing. That's not allowed in making a stroke. And also making sure that either foot deliberately touching the line of play or extension of that line behind the ball, the player must not make a stroke in doing that from that particular stance. And then when we're looking at this rule only, the line of play does not include a reasonable distance on either side. So I think that straddling the line is going to come into play more often on the putting green. I think it's a little harder to do while you're out, maybe in the fairway or making a chip. Maybe you'd see that there, but I think a lot of times that does mainly just come on the putting green. We will have an exception. As you can see, this player here, they're trying to avoid another player's line. That's okay. If you're doing that, you're not going to get a penalty in this situation. It's more so if that's your normal putting stance, then we're going to have a problem there, and we're going to have a violation of the rule. Again, we're going to refer back to Rule 25 if players are using an assisted mobility device that includes the stance taken with any part of that mobility device. So we're just going to go and reference that if we are talking about a player who fits Rule 25. So again, this is pretty self-explanatory. It's letting us know that a ball is moving when it's not at rest. But a ball in play is moving again when it is not at rest on a spot. So pretty self-explanatory, like I said, but there are a few exceptions that the rules will give us. So if a ball has come to rest and it is wobbling, sometimes we talk about it as oscillating, and we saw last week that a ball moved has to leave its spot that it is resting on. So if it's wobbling and just shaking, and stays or returns to its original spot, it's treated as being at rest and is not a moving ball. So like I said, we will look at our exceptions here. There's no penalty when the ball begins to move only after the player begins a backswing for a stroke. We saw this last week in Rule 9, but making a stroke at a moving ball in this situation, we're going to refer back to that rule. It is not under Rule 10, so we're going to look back at Rule 9. And essentially, if the ball starts moving, and after the player begins their backswing and they go on to continue the stroke, that's totally fine. We are going to need to know, however, if the player did cause it to move, whether or not to apply a penalty. Exception 2, making a stroke at a ball falling off of a tee. We're going to see this in teeing area, covered in Rule 6.2b, not this rule. And then when a ball is moving in either temporary water, so maybe there's been maybe not a flash flood, but heavy torrential downpour, and your ball is in some temporary water and it's moving, or maybe in a stream in a penalty area, the player can make a stroke at the moving ball without penalty. Or you can go ahead and take your temporary water relief or penalty area relief by lifting the moving ball. So in either case, the player must not unreasonably delay play. So they can't wait for that ball to move into a more favorable spot. They're going to have to, you can't just let it move to a spot where you like it, maybe 10, 15 yards closer to the hole. But, that's what it means when it says allowing the wind or water current to move the ball to a better place. So you can't just wait for it to get to a place where you like it better. You need to go ahead and make the stroke at the ball. So penalty for breach of this rule. So if you're, straddling that line there on the putting green, you're going to get the general penalty. I'm sorry. I was thinking about the other rule for playing a moving ball. So if the ball is moving and it doesn't include any of these exceptions, you're just going to get the general penalty. So in stroke play, a stroke made in breach of this rule counts, and the player gets 2 penalty strokes. So essentially, you're going to get 3 strokes there if we're doing that math. So advice and other help. We are going to learn what advice is and learn about maybe some other help that we can get. So obviously, a fundamental challenge for the player is deciding the strategy for their play. There are going to be limits on the advice and other help players may get during a round. So what is advice? Here is a definition. This is any verbal comment or action. So maybe you want to lift up that 7-iron you just used on that par 3 that is intended to influence a player in choosing a club, making a stroke, or deciding how to play during a hole or round. So those are things we can't do, right? But advice does not include public information, like maybe where the hole is or where the putting green might be, the locations of things on the course. Maybe if there's a distance from one point to another. So for example, we have a few statements that are not advice. The water is 5 yards short of the front edge of the green, or the wind is blowing from the west. That means on this hole it's blowing from the right. Those are not going to be examples of advice. Something that might be advice would be the pond is 5 yards short of the front edge of the green. So you may want to use enough club to make sure you carry that ball to the middle of the green. So you're making, a player who would say that is suggesting how to play that particular shot. Or the wind is behind us on this hole, so be sure to land the ball short of the green. That's basically telling a player how to play a hole, which is something that we don't want to do. And again, these are public information. This is public information, right? The wind direction or distances. And then finally, the rules. You can always help somebody with the rules. I highly encourage it. That is not considered advice. So during a round, a player must not give advice to anyone in the competition who is playing on the course, ask anyone for advice other than the player's caddy. We'll learn about caddies here in a little bit. Or touch another player's equipment to learn information. That would be advice if given by or asked of the other player, such as touching the other player's clubs or bag to see what is being used. I know this last week at the Arnold Palmer, there was a bit of a question when the broadcast captured Wyndham Clark looking in Sam Burns's bag. That's okay. He didn't touch anything in Sam's bag. He didn't move a towel out of the way. He was just simply looking. If a player is leaving their clubs open, maybe not covering it with their towel or anything like that, go for it. Go ahead and look in their bag and get that information. Totally fine. This does not apply before a round, while play is stopped, or between rounds. So all of these must nots are basically turned off before a round, when the play is stopped, and between rounds. So if you're in a weather delay, advice is free game. So here we're going to see the penalty statement for advice. In both match play and stroke play, we're going to get the general penalty, and here's how we are going to apply it. So if a player asks for or gives the advice when either player is playing a hole, the general penalty is going to be given on the hole being played or just completed. Or when a player asks for or gives advice when both players are between play of two holes, the player gets the general penalty on the next hole. So if I'm out there playing with Sam, we're on the 5th hole. He asks me during the middle of the round, hey, what did you play on that shot just there? I don't answer. He's still going to get the penalty for asking for that advice during that 5th hole. But if we're playing, we've both completed the 5th hole, and he asks for advice on his swing for how to make a particular swing, and we're between the 5th and 6th hole, he is going to get that general penalty applied to the 6th hole. So we're going to see our other forms of play involving partners in rules 22, 23, and 24, where we can have some different ways we can get advice. So if you're playing in a 4-ball event with your partner can give advice. Same with their caddy. That's totally fine. So when we talk about other help, if we're getting help from a caddy, maybe with line of play, or somebody else other than a caddy with our line of play or other directional information. We're not going to be able to set down objects to help us with aiming. There are some restricted areas that the caddy has to be out of or cannot stand in before the player makes a stroke. And then if we have physical help, maybe such as an umbrella helping us to keep rain off of us, how we can protect ourselves from those elements, and maybe times when we cannot. So here we see the first part of this getting help from a caddy. The caddy must not set an object down to provide help, maybe with directional information or the line of play, there are going to be these limitations. While the stroke is made, the caddy must not stand in a position for the player to play towards. So we see here, it is part of a video. The caddy does eventually move, but in using the still, right, if he were to stay there, because that's the direction the player is going to be playing, he'd be in violation of this rule. Luckily, he moves, so it's not a problem, but they can't stay in that position for the player to play towards or do anything else to provide such help, such as pointing out a spot on the ground. And finally, the caddy must not stand in the restricted area, which we will talk about here in a couple of slides, when not allowed under Rule 10.2b4. So we'll go over that here shortly. So here we're talking about getting help from any person other than the caddy. So the player must not get help with the line of play or directional information from any person other than their caddy, with some exceptions. So that person may provide help by giving public information in relation to an object. So maybe, you're playing a hole that has a blind fairway. You can say that tree is behind the green. That's not a big deal. It's basically public information, so we're okay with that. Or the second exception would be, other than when the player's ball is on the putting green, that person may stand in a position for the player to play towards. So this person here is giving the direction. Obviously, they can stand there to get them, directed. But they are going to have to move away before that stroke is made. So same thing with the caddy situation we saw with the hill. In both of these scenarios, that person has to move before the stroke is made. However, this rule does not prohibit any person from standing close to the hole to attend the flagstick. So this is one of those common sense statements. Totally fine for people to attend the flagstick. This rule is not going to prohibit them from doing so. So while on the putting green, while the stroke is being made, the caddy must not deliberately stand in a location on or close to the player's line of play or do anything else, such as pointing out a spot on the putting green. So they are allowed to point that out. It's just they can't just stay there for that time. There's no setting down an object to help with aiming, taking a stance, or swinging. So here we see this player set the club down to help them aim off of the tee. We are not allowed to do that. So we cannot set that object down and keep it there to show us where we should aim or position our feet. In this rule, intent is involved as to why that object has been set down. So for this rule to apply, the object has to be set down with the intent to help with lining up the player's feet or body. But if the club's set down, so maybe you just set it down behind you because it's cart path only and you want to take a couple of clubs with you out into the fairway, highly encourage that for pace of play. But if you just set it down behind you and you're not doing it for any reason, not to help you aim or anything like that, then that's okay. This rule is not going to apply. And so what we mean by set an object down, that means the object is in contact with the ground and the player is not touching the object. So it has to satisfy both of those requirements in order to be considered a player setting an object down. So if the player breaches this rule, they cannot avoid penalty by removing the object before the stroke is made. I would just say, just don't do it. Just don't set that object down to help you aim. You can put it like across your knees. You're not setting the object down at that point. Obviously, you're gonna remove it anyway. But setting that object down to help you, just don't even do it. Then you'll be fine and you don't have to worry about breaching the rule. So this is also going to apply, say you're playing early in the morning, the dew hasn't gone away, and you've drawn a line where you are trying to aim the ball where you want your feet to aim. That's not going to be allowed either. Where we see this not applied is when a ball marker is used to mark the spot of a ball or to the ball when it is placed on a spot. So I think that's kind of like a common sense thing there. It's not going to apply to that ball marker when we're using it to mark that ball. But a ball marker that meets the definition of alignment device in the equipment rules is covered under 4.3. So here we see the little call out definition of alignment device and treatment of ball markers. But I would just recommend looking through for Rule 4 if you have any questions on that. We are going to see some modifications to this rule in Rule 25 for players who are blind. So if you are out there with a player who is blind, you can definitely look at the modification. There's not going to be a a a breach in certain scenarios. So basically you can set that object down to help with aiming, but that object is going to need to be removed. If it is not, then we will be in breach of the rule. So I mentioned earlier, we are going to look at this restricted area for caddies. So when a player begins taking a stance for the stroke, so this means they have to have at least 1 foot in position for that stance, as we see here in that diagram. And until the stroke is made, there are going to be limitations relating to when and why a player's caddy may deliberately stand on or close to an extension of their play behind the ball. This is considered the restricted area, and they are going to be as follows. So again, this calls out this internal definition of restricted area. So the caddy must not stand in the restricted area to help the player with aiming. I think it was several years back, but a lot of times you did see on the LPGA tour, players would take their stance, their caddy would do a quick double check, and then their caddy would move away. They would be standing in that restricted area, and this is not allowed anymore. So back then it was fine. The players weren't in violation, but now the rules have changed and caddies are not allowed to do that. So like I said, and this is actually what usually happened with some of tour players, they wouldn't say anything, they would just move away. So this is signaling to the player that, yeah, they're actually correctly aimed where they want to go. And again, it's this whole premise that the player has to be able to make the stroke themselves. There's not going to be a penalty if the player backs away before making the stroke and the caddy moves away from that restricted area, and then the player starts all over again. So that's going to be okay. So other than aiming, if the caddy is helping the player with something specific, they can stand in that restricted area, but only if the caddy moves away before the stroke is made, and provided this positioning is not part of a regular routine. So, I think we do give this example eventually, but if it's a really sunny, if they're hitting right into the sun, they need to see where that ball's going, and the caddy kind of like needs to be on the lookout for that, then that's going to be okay. There also is no penalty if the caddy was inadvertently standing in the restricted area. Here we see the caddy is just kind of standing there, maybe marking down some notes in their book and not really doing much. There's not going to be a penalty there. So like I said with my previous statement, any other person or is able to stand there and track the flight of the ball. Again, we're going to look in rules 22, 23, and 24 in our forms of play involving partners and advice givers. So rules 22 and 23 do not allow a player's partner or partner's caddy to stand in the restricted area to help track the flight of the ball. And rule 24 has the same restriction on an authorized advice giver in team play. So again, for players who are blind, we're going to look in rule 25.2D for a modification of this rule. So when playing a stroke, a player must not play a stroke when getting physical help from their caddy or any other person, with their caddy or any other person or object deliberately positioned to eliminate distractions or give protection from sunlight, wind, rain, or the elements. So they can't stand there with the umbrella over their head. This rule does not prohibit the player from taking their own actions to protect against the elements while making a stroke. So if you want to hold your umbrella over your head while you're putting or trying to make a stroke, that's okay. The rules are going to let you do that. It is pretty difficult to do. So just a word of caution there. We also are not prohibited for asking any other person who is not deliberately positioned by the player to remain in position or move out of the way. So maybe if a spectator is casting a shadow over the player's ball, the rule doesn't prohibit the player from asking them to move out of the way or remain in position. So penalty for breach of rule 10.2, we're going to get the general penalty. So caddies, we're going to learn what caddies can do, how they can help a player during a round in this section. So a caddy is someone who helps a player during a round by maybe carrying, transporting, or handling clubs. They're a person who might not be named as a caddy by the player. So we want to take caution. If somebody's transporting clubs, they then turn into a caddy, which then we need to make sure we're okay with. This is a picture of me and my favorite caddy. My husband is a caddies for me sometimes. So threw that in there. But a person who, you know, if they're carrying the clubs, this exception is going to be made, though, if the player is moving their clubs out of the way as a courtesy. But if they are there physically, like say between holes, if a junior wants their parent to start pushing their push cart, they're not moving them out of the way and they're not doing it as a courtesy. They're literally caddying for them. That exception is not going to apply in this situation. So a caddy can also help during a round by giving advice, and a player's caddy is the only person other than a partner or their partner's caddy a player may ask for advice. We're going to find out here what caddies can do under the rules. So a player is only allowed one caddy at a time. So the only one person can do all of the things the caddy can do. However, there are some limitations. The player must not have more than one caddy at a time. And the player may change caddies during a round, but must not do so temporarily for the sole purpose of getting advice from a new caddy. So, if your friend, you can have a friend who maybe has played earlier in the day come caddy for you. Not a big deal. That's totally fine. We get that question every so often during our championships, but you can't just have somebody caddy for you for a couple of shots just to get advice from them. That's going to be in breach of this rule. Anybody who's maybe carrying things for that player, maybe umbrella, food or drinks, or who's just watching or walking along with the player is not going to be the player's caddy unless they're named as such by the player. Or also maybe they might carry, transport, or handle the player's clubs. So there we see at the beginning of the definition, um, moving things out of the way or as a courtesy, those aren't going to be considered caddying. So we did get a question about advice. If you ask what club was used well in the past, um, I'm going to double check. So I will get back to you. I believe it is that's okay. It's like just to make like for that previous shot. So, you're on a par three, you ask a player just tees off and you're like, "Hey, what did you just use on that shot?" That's not that's not allowed. So give me a second and I will double check on that. Um, but two or more players may share a caddy. So this is okay. But when there is a rules issue involving a specific action of a shared caddy and it needs to be decided which player the action was taken for, if the caddy's action was taken at the specific direction of one of the players sharing the caddy, the action was taken for that player. So if none of these players specifically directed that action, the action is treated as taken for the player sharing the caddy whose ball was involved. So for the first one, the player directed the caddy to do something, that player's ball is going to be, or that action is treated as taking for that player's ball. If neither player says anything, but there was, an action that was taken, it's going to be whoever the player whose ball was involved in that action. And then if none of the players sharing the caddy specifically directed the caddy's action and none of those players' balls were involved, all the players sharing the caddy will get the penalty. So here we're going to see in the committee procedures, section 8, the committee can adopt a local rule prohibiting or requiring the use of caddies. So I do know for our state juniors, we prohibit the use of caddies. You can use them in all of our other championships, but that is something that we do prohibit in our junior. So you are allowed to do that. And then again, we're going to turn over to Rule 25 for players with certain disabilities who can also get help from an aide. So an aide would be different than a caddy. So penalty for breach of Rule 10.3a, the player is going to get the general penalty for each hole during which they are helped by more than one caddy at any one time. And again, if the breach happens or continues between two holes, the player gets the general penalty for the next hole. So what caddies may do, these are going to be examples of what a caddy is allowed to do. These are actions always allowed. So obviously they can carry, transport, and handle the player's clubs or other equipment. They can search for the ball. They can give information, advice, and other help before the stroke is made. Obviously, we're hoping they're going to help to smooth bunkers or take actions to care for the course. They can remove sand and loose soil and repair damage on the putting green. That is totally fine. They are able to do that. Also, they can remove or attend the flag stick. They're also able to lift the player's ball once it's reasonable to conclude that the player will take relief under a rule. So if it's there in that penalty area and they know their player is going to take relief, they can go ahead and pick up that golf ball. Fine to mark the spot of the player's ball, lift and replace the ball on the putting green. So again, on the putting green, they're fine to clean the player's ball, maybe remove loose impediments and movable obstructions. Those are all kind of common sense things and things that we often see players do. So this next section is going to be actions allowed only with the player's authorization. So a caddy can take these actions only when the rules allow the player to take them and only with the player's authorization. And the authorization is not a blanket statement. It has to be given specifically each time. So at the start of the round, you can't just say, hey, yeah, that's totally fine. Do that. I'm giving you my authorization. It has to happen every single time. Restore conditions that were worsened after the player's ball came to rest. We talked a lot about Rule 8 a couple of weeks ago, so you'll be able to check that out. When the player's ball is anywhere except on the putting green, lift the player's ball under a rule requiring it to be replaced. So again, these are the two times where the player has to authorize the caddy to do these things. Finally, we're going to see actions not allowed. So caddy cannot do this regardless of anything, regardless if the player says it's okay. Concede the next stroke, a hole, or the match to the opponent. Agree with the opponent on the match score. Replace a ball unless the caddy has lifted or moved the ball. Drop or place a ball in taking relief. Caddies are not allowed to do that. And finally, decide to take relief under a rule. So, deciding for the player that they are going to take an unplayable, that's a no-no. Only the player can decide if they're going to take an unplayable. Or if maybe they're taking relief from free relief from a cart path or a penalty area, what have you. The caddy cannot decide that for the player. However, the caddy can advise the player to do so, but ultimately this is going to be the player's decision. So the player is responsible for caddy's actions both during their round and while play is stopped under 5.7, but not before or after a round. So there's this duration of time the player is responsible. It's kind of like a little bit of a timeline. Before, we're fine. During, the players responsible, including if play is stopped for weather. And then after the round, the player is not responsible. If a caddy's action breaches a rule or would breach a rule if the action was taken by the player gets the penalty under that rule. So maybe deliberately stopping or deflecting a ball, which we'll find out about shortly, cause the player's ball in play to move. Those are going to be actions that the player would get the penalty for. The caddy's not playing. How can you penalize the caddy, right? You can't give the caddy a penalty stroke or a general penalty. The player's ultimately going to be on the hook for that penalty. So an application of a rule depends on whether the player is aware of certain facts. The player's knowledge is treated as including whatever is known by their caddy. So their caddy is essentially what I like to say, the caddy is an extension of the player. So you got to be careful and make sure that your caddy is also following the rules accordingly, because it could eventually cause you to get a penalty, which we would not want. So that was Rule 10. I will touch on the advice thing here at the end of the presentation. So we're going to jump right into Rule 11. So Rule 11, the general principle is that, in 11.1, accidents happen. Things happen out on the golf course. The rules recognize that. Generally speaking, accidentally stopped or deflected balls are played as they lie. There are going to be exceptions, as we have seen over these last several weeks. But where the ball is played from, when those exceptions apply, and if there are any penalties. In the second part of this rule, we're going to talk about deliberately putting things in the way. Our general guiding principle is that deliberately stopped or deflected balls are not played as they lie. There are penalties, and certain people will get them for deliberately stopping or deflecting a ball. And procedures for where and how deliberately stopped or deflected balls are put back into play. So this is more of an intent plus outcome oriented rule. And finally, in the third subsection of this rule, these are going to be action oriented. So, deliberately taking things out of the way, maybe if there's penalties and who gets them for deliberately moving objects or altering physical conditions on the course to affect a ball while it is in motion. And then objects that can be moved without penalty. So this rule applies at any time a ball is in play in motion, whether after a stroke or otherwise, except when a ball has been dropped in a relief area and has not yet come to rest. Rule 11 is not going to apply. We are going to look at Rule 14 because Rule 14 uses different outcomes tailored to dropping. If it's accidental, the drop counts. If it's deliberate, the drop does not count as one of the two drops required before placing. It also penalizes any player or player of the caddy that deliberately deflects or stops a dropped ball in motion. So there we see our exception where Rule 11 does not apply. So if a player's ball in motion accidentally hits any person, including the player or outside influence, there is no penalty to any player. Most people are going to be considered outside influences. So this rule includes all people who are outside influences and those people who are not outside influences, such as the player, player's caddy, opponents, caddies in match play, partners, and their caddies in four ball or foursomes. So in general, most people are outside influences unless they are those people I just listed. So this is true. So again, if it accidentally hits any person, there's no penalty to any player. If it hits the player, the opponent, or any other player, or any of their caddies, or their equipment. And all of these things are equipment. We do have an exception in stroke play only, but if the player's ball in motion hits another ball at rest on the putting green, and both balls were on the putting green before the stroke, the player whose ball is in motion that then hits that ball at rest is going to get the general penalty of 2 strokes. So there the ball hits that one, goes into the hole. That's fine, but you're still going to be on the hook for the general penalty of 2 strokes. So when a ball is played from anywhere except on the putting green, so here this player is chipping, if it accidentally hits any person or outside influence, the ball must normally be played as it lies, except if it comes to rest on any person, animal, or moving outside influence. We're not going to play the ball as it lies. In these cases, playing the ball as it lies is either not possible, dangerous, or not advisable. So, if it's on something moving, maybe that moving tractor there might not be possible to play it, might not be possible and dangerous to play it out of somebody's pocket. And while that dog doesn't look that dangerous, I wouldn't advise playing it out of their mouth. So here we're going to see some two different scenarios. So when the ball comes to rest on any of those person, animals, or moving outside influences anywhere except on the putting green. And then what happens if they come to rest on one of those located on the putting green? So this is anywhere except on the putting green. In this picture, it comes from a video where Rory McIlroy apparently hit it into the tree, and maybe it landed in the spectator's pocket. But that comes to rest on any person. They're just going to drop the ball or an original ball in the estimated point right under where the ball first came to rest on those objects within 1 club length. And it must be in the same area of the course as that estimated point and not nearer the hole. So, we're going to take that location under where the ball first came to rest. If you're in a bunker, you stay in a bunker. If you're in the rough, which is considered the general area, you're going to stay in the general area, and so on. However, if a ball comes to rest on any of these things located on the putting green, the player must place the original ball or another ball on that estimated spot right under where the ball first came to rest. And here, we'll just replace it by setting it down by hand on that required spot and letting it go so that it stays on that spot. So in breach of Rule 11.1b, we're going to get the general penalty, but that penalty is going to come under it's going to be considered under Rule 14. So when a ball is played from the putting green, if a ball in motion is played from the putting green and it accidentally hits the player or an outside influence, the ball must normally be played as it lies. But if we know for sure, so we had that known or virtually certain concept that we talked about last week, that the ball in motion hit any of the following, the player must replay the stroke by playing the original ball or another ball from where that stroke was made. So we are going to see here, if it hits any of these following things, the player is going to need to replay the stroke. So any person, movable obstruction, or animal, other than the player or a person attending the flagstick, we're going to play the ball as it lies in this situation. If it hits a movable obstruction, we're going to replay the stroke, except if it's the club used to make the stroke, a ball marker on the putting green, a ball at rest on the putting green, or a flagstick. The ball will just be played as it lies and the stroke counts. So if it hits any of the following, if it hits an animal, other than those defined as a loose impediment, there we see a little insect. In that case, the ball is played as it lies and the stroke counts. Or if the player replays the stroke but does so from a wrong place, they get the general penalty under Rule 14. It's not going to fall under this rule. It's going to fall under Rule 14. If they do not replay the stroke and they were supposed to, they get the general penalty and the stroke counts, but we're not going to be on the hook for playing from a wrong place. I will be honest, it is a tricky rule. 11 is something I do personally also continue to struggle with. It's something that really doesn't happen that often out there. So if you are still confused or need further clarification, what I would say is just read through the rule and kind of what I've done in my book is just make a list of when am I supposed to replay it and when am I not? And that will kind of help you to continue getting better at learning this rule, which is something I'm trying to do. So in Rule 25, we are going to see a modification for players who use assisted mobility devices so that a ball hitting the device is played as it lies. So deliberately deflected or stopped by a person. We are going to see there are definitely more words in the exception than in the general principle. So this rule is going to only apply when it is known or virtually certain a player's ball in motion was deliberately deflected or stopped by a person. So if we don't know for sure, if we don't know that it was deliberately deflected or stopped, we can't really apply this rule. We just, play the ball as it lies. But again, if we have that 95% or more standard, if we meet that, then we apply this rule. So if a person deliberately touches the ball in motion, or the ball in motion hits any equipment or other object, or any person that a player deliberately positioned in a particular location so that that equipment, object, or person might deflect or stop the ball in motion. So basically putting something there as maybe a backstop deliberately. Or that a player deliberately left in a particular location. So that equipment, object, or person might deflect or stop the ball in motion. And if the ball hits, with the exception of the ball marker or any ball at rest, Rule 11.2 is not going to apply in this situation. So we talked about that in 11.1. This is any equipment other than or other object. So the ball marker, while it can be equipment, this is not going to apply in this rule. We are going to have our exception, ball deliberately deflected or stopped in match play when no reasonable chance it can be holed. An opponent's ball in motion that is deliberately deflected or stopped at a time when there is no reasonable chance it can be holed. Essentially, when the ball is already past the hole, there's no way it's going to go in the hole, then this rule does not apply because there's no way the ball's going to get into that hole. And when done, and so if you've deflected the ball when the ball needed to be whole or hold to tie the hole, it is covered in Rule 3.2b, not in this rule. So this exception is going to be covered back in Rule 3, not in this rule. And then for a player to have the ball or ball marker lifted before a stroke is made, if they reasonably believe the ball or ball marker might help or interfere with play, we're going to look at a different rule. This does not, it's going to be in Rule 15. Rule 11 does not apply in this scenario. So when the penalty applies to a player, so a player gets the general penalty if they deliberately deflect or stop any ball in motion. And this is going to be true whether it's the player's own ball or a ball played by an opponent or a ball played by another player in stroke play. So again, in match play or in stroke play, the player will get the general penalty, no matter if it's theirs or a different ball. So we saw this exception earlier. There's not going to be a penalty if a player lifts their ball moving in water. That's maybe temporary water or in a penalty area when taking relief under these rules. So the ball is moving, but it's not being, the ball is in motion technically, but it's not, we're applying a different rule in this scenario. So when we're applying this penalty, we are going to look in our foursome and our partner play rules, which are 22 and 23. Rule 22 covers foursomes and Rule 23 covers four ball. So if we know that the player's ball in motion was deliberately deflected or stopped by a person, it must not be played as it lies. Instead, the player must take relief. So if the stroke was made anywhere except from the putting green, we're going to go where the ball would have come to rest. So maybe in the general area, bunker, penalty area, maybe it would have come to rest out of bounds. That lady stopping the ball from going out of bounds. We want we want to just let the ball do its thing and come to rest where it is meant to come to rest. And then in the second part, if the stroke is made from a putting green, that stroke must be replayed. So here's anywhere except a putting green. The player must take relief based on the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest, if not deflected or stopped. So when the ball would have come to rest anywhere on a putting green, when the ball would have come to rest on the putting green, or when the ball would have come to rest out of bounds. So when the ball would have come to rest anywhere on the course except the putting green, the player is going to drop the original ball or another ball in this relief area. We're going to use the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest. The player is going to get 1 club length, but there are going to be some limits. It must be in that same area of the course. So if it would have come to rest in the bunker, you're going to estimate that spot. You get a club length, but you must keep it in that bunker, not near the reference point, not near the hole, than that reference point. We do have an exception. If the ball is estimated to have come to rest in the penalty area, if the estimated spot of the ball is in a penalty area, the player is not required to take relief under this rule. Alternatively, the player may directly take relief from the penalty area. So this is just saying if your ball would have originally come to rest in that pond, you don't then have to just go and drop your ball in the pond. You can automatically just go and take your penalty area relief based on where the ball would have last crossed the edge of the penalty area. So when the ball would have come to rest on the putting green, the player is going to place. So putting green starts with a P, place. The original ball or another ball on the estimated spot where the ball would have come to rest. We're going to, use our hand, replace the ball, let it come to rest on that spot. Unfortunately, like in this scenario we see with this picture, if the ball would have come to rest out of bounds, the player's just going to have to take stroke and distance relief. So they'll go back to where they originally played that ball from. Maybe it's the teeing area, maybe it's the fairway. But if it would have come to rest out of bounds, unfortunately, you're going to have to take that stroke and distance penalty. So penalty for playing from a wrong place in breach of this rule. We're going to get the general penalty, but it's going to fall under 14, even though you are breaching this part of a stroke made from anywhere except a putting green. So when the stroke is made from the putting green, the player must replay the stroke by playing the original ball or another ball from the spot where the stroke was made. And if the player replays the stroke but does so from a wrong place, they get the general penalty. If the player does not replay the stroke, they're going to get the general penalty and the stroke counts, but the player is not played from the wrong place. So we're getting you off the hook from the wrong place penalty. You're still going to get that general penalty. Maybe it's 2 strokes in stroke play, and that stroke does count. So thanks for bearing with me. We are in the home stretch of this rule, but when a ball is in motion, a player must not deliberately take any of these actions to affect where the ball might come to rest. So we're going to want to let the ball do its thing. While the ball is in motion, we're not going to want to alter physical conditions by taking any of the actions listed in Rule 8. Maybe replacing a divot or pressing down a raised area of turf. These conditions to affect where that ball is going to end up. When the ball is in motion, we're not going to deliberately lift or remove a loose impediment or movable obstruction that the ball may then, roll over, come to rest by, that sort of thing. So the player's in breach of this rule for taking these deliberate actions, even if the action does not affect where the ball comes to rest. We are going to see an exception here where this does not apply. The exception of moving a flag stick, ball at rest on putting green, and player equipment. So this rule doesn't prohibit a player from lifting or moving a removed flag stick, a ball at rest on the putting green, or equipment belonging to any player, other than a ball at rest anywhere except the putting green or a ball marker anywhere on the course. In this case, this rule does apply. Where it does not apply, removing the flag stick from the hole while a ball is in motion, we are going to look over at Rule 13 where that is covered, which is not covered by this rule. So penalty for taking an action that is not allowed in breach of Rule 11.3. We are going to get the general penalty. And again, we're going to look out in Rule 22 if we're playing in foursome play, and Rule 23 in four ball. Here we're going to see either player may act for the side, and the action of the partner concerning the player's ball or equipment is treated as the action of the player. All right. I know that was a lot. I appreciate you sticking with me throughout this evening. But I think we hopefully have accomplished some of our goals, finding out what a stroke is and how to prepare for one. So this is the forward movement of the club made to strike the ball. We learned about what types of advice you can and cannot receive. Things we can, let's just go ahead and think of all the positive things we can get. Locations of things, distances, wind direction, or the rules. What can a caddy really do? So while you can only have one at a time, they can carry clubs, give advice, and help with the rules. What happens when my ball accidentally hits something? So the ball is played as it lies almost all of the time. Again, I would just consider looking through the rule and slowly reading through it to get a good grasp of when do I replay it or when do I just play it as it lies? And what happens if something deliberately is done to my golf ball? So the player gets the general penalty if they deliberately deflect or stop a ball in motion. And I am looking for the answer to that question. And advice. I might just actually, well, the group probably wants to know. What I'll do, I'll double check because I'm almost 95% sure. I will make a note to send it out in the email follow up with the link to the video. I hope that's okay. So we'll do that. I'll put that information in there. Just I want to make sure then I can reference it in the actual rule book. So I will do that and we will send out the information. We will look to get this uploaded sometime this week. We are a smidge busy here at the office. We have another rules seminar tomorrow. So we will look to get that uploaded and then I will 100% give you the correct answer for that question. So thank you all for sticking with me this evening. Hopefully you can get out and play some golf soon. I know the weather's going to be a lot better, but if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to send us an email, give us a call here at the office. But everybody else, have a great evening.